the British trick that made German pilots shoot at ghost airfields. The date is 17th September 1940, and Lieutenant Hans Becker sits in the nose of a Heinkel. He 111 bomber at 4,000 meters over the Kent countryside. Below him, through breaks in the cloud, he can see his target, an RAF airfield with its characteristic runway lights glowing in the darkness. He's been briefing on this target for 3 days. The reconnaissance photographs showed Spitfires dispersed around the perimeter. The intelligence summary confirmed it as an active fighter station. Now, approaching from the east, everything matches his briefing. The runway lights form the expected pattern. The perimeter track is visible. He can even see what appears to be the control tower, a darker shadow against the surrounding buildings. He signals the bombardier. The aircraft steadies. The first stick of bombs falls away. Becker watches the impacts through his bomb sight. Perfect placement across what should be the hangars. Secondary explosions bloom orange in the darkness. They've hit fuel storage, perhaps ammunition. The pilot banks away as anti-aircraft fire begins. Desultory and inaccurate. Mission accomplished. Except that 3 kilometers to the north, the real RAF Biggin Hill continues operations, completely untouched. Becker has just expended 2,000 kilograms of high explosive on an empty field containing nothing but wood, canvas, and an elaborate lighting system operated by 3 elderly men from the Royal Observer Corps. He's bombed a ghost, and he'll never know. By the autumn of 1940, Britain faced a bombing campaign of unprecedented intensity. The Luftwaffe was flying hundreds of sorties nightly against British cities and military installations. Fighter commands' airfields, the crucial bases that had won the Battle of Britain, remained priority targets. The mathematics were brutally simple. Britain had roughly 70 operational airfields supporting fighter command and bomber command. The Luftwaffe knew their locations from pre-war intelligence and reconnaissance. Even with Britain's increasingly effective night fighter defences and radar network, a significant percentage of German bombers reached their targets. Anti-aircraft fire shot down perhaps 2 to 3% of attacking aircraft, not nearly enough to deter sustained campaigns. Fighter interception rates at night remained abysmal, perhaps 5% of raiders engaged. The simple reality was that most German bombers attacking British targets would reach those targets, drop their bombs, and return home safely. Between July and October 1940, the Luftwaffe flew over 30,000 bombing sorties against British targets. Even a modest success rate, 20% of bombs hitting militarily significant targets, translated to catastrophic cumulative damage. RAF Kenley suffered 56 attacks in 3 months. Biggin Hill was bombed 15 times in August alone. Aircraft production facilities, particularly those manufacturing fighters, endured sustained assault. The British had tried everything conventional. More anti-aircraft guns. Never enough. More night fighters. Ineffective without reliable interception. More smoke screens. Useful but limited. Dispersing aircraft. Only partially effective. Hardening facilities. Expensive and slow. What was needed seemed paradoxical. A way to make the Germans drop their bombs on targets that didn't exist, whilst protecting the real installations. The challenge appeared insoluble. How do you make a bomber crew, approaching at 4,000 meters in darkness, choose the wrong target? The solution emerged from the vivid imagination of Colonel John Turner and the Air Ministry's extraordinary Directorate of Camouflage under Wing Commander Frederick Beddington. Turner, working from an office in London's Shaftesbury Avenue, proposed something audacious. Don't just hide real targets. Create false ones so convincing that enemy bombers would attack them preferentially. The system that emerged had 2 distinct components. The first, designated Q sites, replicated airfields. The second, called Starfish sites, from the acronym SF for Special Fire, simulated burning cities to draw bombers away from urban areas during sustained raids. A Q site was an elaborate theatrical production staged across approximately 40 hectares of countryside. The location had to match the general topography of the real airfield it was protecting. Similar landscape, similar relationship to nearby towns or geographical features, positioned along likely bomber approach routes. The sites were typically located 5 to 12 kilometres from the real airfield, far enough to separate them, but close enough that a German navigator, working with imperfect maps and instruments in darkness, might reasonably mistake one for the other. The lighting system was the crucial element. A team from the Air Ministry's Directorate of Research, working with engineers from the General Electric Company, designed portable lighting rigs that mimicked every aspect of an operational airfield at night. Runway lights used specially filtered lamps. Chance Brothers manufactured thousands of units that produced the characteristic dim red glow of genuine runway flare path lighting. The lights were positioned to create the exact patterns that German reconnaissance had photographed at real RAF stations. More sophisticated sites included lights that simulated aircraft hangar doors opening, vehicle headlamps moving along perimeter tracks, and even the distinctive blue glare of welding equipment from maintenance areas. The Starfish sites were even more dramatic. These installations used oil-burning systems to create fires that mimicked bombing damage. When activated, these could generate conflagrations visible from 50 kilometers, the exact signature a German bomber crew would expect to see when approaching a city that was already under attack. The oil reservoirs and ignition systems were manufactured at various locations, with final assembly conducted by Royal Engineer detachments working with civilian contractors. By December 1940, approximately 90 Q sites and 40 Starfish installations were operational across Britain. Each Q site typically required a permanent crew of 3 to 5 personnel, often men too old for military service or those in reserved occupations. The operating cost per site was approximately £50 monthly, a trivial sum compared to the value of a single Hurricane fighter. The first documented success came on the night of the 3rd of September 1940. A Q site protecting RAF Hornchurch, designated QL, received attack by 9 He-11-1 bombers. The crews reported successful strikes against Hornchurch's hangars and fuel storage. In reality, they'd bombed empty fields fitted with canvas aircraft silhouettes and oil drum fires. Hornchurch, 5 kilometers away, detected no German aircraft overhead. Similar successes multiplied rapidly. The Q site protecting Biggin Hill, arguably Fighter Command's most critical sector station, was attacked repeatedly throughout September and October. Records from debriefed German prisoners of war consistently showed pilots reporting successful attacks on Biggin Hill when the actual station had been untouched. The psychological impact proved even more valuable than the physical protection. German bomber crews began reporting confusing intelligence. Airfields they'd reportedly destroyed continued operating. Targets they'd successfully attacked according to observed bomb impacts showed no reduction in operational activity. Some crews reported seeing multiple airfields, where intelligence suggested only one existed. This erosion of confidence in target intelligence affected German operational planning. If they couldn't trust that a successfully attacked target was actually damaged, how could they assess bombing campaigns' effectiveness? The Starfish sites proved particularly devastating during the sustained raids on cities. On the night of 8 December 1940, a Starfish site near Bristol was activated. The resulting fires drew 57 bombers away from Bristol's city centre. They dropped over 130 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiaries on open countryside. The Decoy site was destroyed, exactly as intended, but Bristol's docks and residential areas were largely spared. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The Germans attempted their own deception measures, but with markedly less sophistication. German dummy airfields, Scheinflugplätze, consisted primarily of static displays, wooden aircraft representations, and painted runways visible from altitude. These could fool reconnaissance aircraft, but were useless against bombers whose crews approached at night using radio navigation and visual confirmation of lights. The fundamental difference was operational philosophy. German decoys were passive, meant to be photographed, not attacked. British decoys were active, designed to draw actual bombs. The Americans, studying British methods, developed similar systems for the defense of the Panama Canal and later for Pacific bases. However, American decoy technology never matched British sophistication, primarily because the United States mainland never faced sustained strategic bombing. The Americans focused instead on camouflage, hiding real installations rather than creating false ones. The Japanese employed decoy techniques in the Pacific, but these were primarily static installations designed to deceive aerial reconnaissance. They never developed dynamic lighting systems comparable to British Q sights. What distinguished British deception technology was its theatrical completeness. A Q sight wasn't just a field with lights, it was a performance, continuously updated based on German intelligence gathering. When the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance detected new construction at a genuine airfield, the corresponding Q site received similar construction. False buildings that from 4,000 meters looked identical to real ones. If the real airfield's lighting pattern changed, runway lights repositioned due to construction, for example, the Q site's lighting changed to match. The quantifiable impact of Britain's decoy program remains subject to historical debate, primarily because proving a negative, bombs that didn't hit real targets because they hit false ones, requires inferential analysis. However, certain statistics are reliably documented. By the end of 1941, Q sites had received over 440 documented bombing attacks. The tonnage dropped on these false targets exceeded 2,000 tons. High explosive and incendiaries that otherwise would have struck real installations. More significantly, the psychological impact was substantial. Post-war interrogations of Luftwaffe bomber crews revealed widespread confusion about target identification. Many pilots reported the unsettling experience of attacking targets that seemed legitimate, observing what appeared to be successful strikes, then discovering from intelligence summaries that the target remained operational. This bred a corrosive uncertainty that affected morale and operational confidence. The broader influence extended far beyond World War II. The principle of active deception, making the enemy attack false targets, became foundational to modern electronic warfare. Radar decoys, infrared signature generators, even software that creates false digital signatures in cyber warfare, all descend conceptually from Colonel Turner's theatrical airfields. Modern military deception doctrine still references the British World War II experience as the exemplars of how small investments in convincing deception can produce strategic effects disproportionate to their cost. No complete Q site survives today. The installations were deliberately dismantled after the war, and the sites returned to agriculture or development. However, aerial photography archives hold remarkable evidence. Photographs taken in 1944 and 1945 show the ghostly outlines of these installations, the geometric patterns of false runways, the positions of lighting arrays, the foundations of canvas hangars. The Imperial War Museum holds examples of the lighting equipment, the Chance Brothers lamps, the control panels, the fuel systems for Starfish sites. These artifacts seem impossibly simple for devices that deceived an entire air force. The darkness over Kent is clearing now, and Lieutenant Becker's Heinkel crosses the channel homeward. He's confident of mission success. The target was illuminated exactly as briefed. The bombing run was textbook perfect. Secondary explosions confirmed strikes on significant installations. His crew will receive commendations. The intelligence summary will record another successful attack on RAF Biggin Hill. Except that Biggin Hill is untouched. Its Spitfires will fly again tomorrow. Its controllers will vector fighters against tomorrow's raids. Nothing has been damaged except Becker's certainty, and certainty, in war, is a weapon as valuable as bombs. This is what Colonel Turner and his small team achieved with lights, canvas, and imagination. They created doubt. They made the Germans question what they'd seen, what they'd hit, whether the smoking ruins below represented victory or elaborate theatre. They turned empty fields into targets more valuable than the real installations they protected, because every bomb dropped on a ghost was a bomb that didn't hit substance. The British didn't just hide their airfields. They created new ones that existed only to be destroyed, again and again, night after night, whilst the real stations flew on. 3 elderly men in an observer corps post, operating light switches according to a carefully rehearsed script, defending an airfield more effectively than anti-aircraft batteries costing millions. Shadows and lights defeating metal and explosive. Theatre defeating logistics. The ghost airfields weren't illusions. They were real enough to absorb bombs, real enough to save lives, real enough to win a campaign. They simply weren't what they appeared to be. And that, ultimately, is the definition of perfect deception.